Welcome to episode 41 of Gods and Heroes of Ancient Greece. Today we begin with the epic tale of the story of King Oedipus. With the birth of Oedipus, his youth, his flight, and the murder of his father. Laius, son of Labducus, of the line of Cadmus, was king of Thebes. For many years he had been married to Jocasta, daughter of Monesius, a noble of that city. Yet she had borne him no children. Because he longed so deeply for an heir, he questioned the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, and was given this answer: Laius, son of Labducus, you desire a child. Well then, you shall have a son. But fate has decreed that you shall lose your life at his hands. This is the will of Zeus, son of Cronos, who heard the curse of Pelops, whom you once robbed of his son. Laius had committed this wrong in his youth, when he had been forced to flee from his own country. He had taken refuge with King Pelops, and then repaid that kindness of his host with rank ingratitude. For at the Nemean Games he had carried off Chrysippus, Pelops' beautiful son. Since Laius was well aware of what he had done, he believed the oracle, and lived apart from his wife for a long time. But the great love they had for each other drove them into each other's arms again, in spite of the warning they had received. And in due time, Jocasta bore her husband a son. When the child was before their eyes, they remembered the utterance of the oracle, and in an effort to escape the decree of fate, decided to expose the newborn infant in the mountain region of Cithaeron, his ankles pierced and bound with a thong. But the shepherd, who had been chosen to carry out this cruel command, had pity on the innocent boy, and handed him over to a fellow herdsman, who on the slopes of those same mountains pastured the sheep of Polybus, king of Corinth. Then he went home and pretended to have done as he had been told. The king and his wife, Jocasta, were certain the child must have died of hunger and thirst, or been torn apart by wild beasts, and that the oracle, therefore, could not possibly have been fulfilled. They eased their conscience with the thought that by sacrificing the child, they had saved him from murdering his father, and resumed the course of their days with lighter hearts. In the meantime, the shepherd Polybus loosed the bonds of the child he had accepted, not knowing who he was or whence he came, and because his ankles showed wounds, he called the boy Oedipus, or swollen foot. Then he took him to his master, the king of Corinth, who had compassion on the foundling, and bade his wife Merope rear him as if he were their very own son. And the court and the entire country did indeed regard him as thus. He grew into young manhood as a prince, never doubting that he was a son and heir of King Polybus, who had no other children. But chance shattered his joyful self-assurance. Once, at a banquet, a citizen of Corinth, who bore him a grudge from sheer envy, grew heated with wine, and called to Oedipus, who was reclining on the couch opposite him, that he was not a king's true son. The youth was so deeply disturbed by this taunt that he could hardly wait for the end of the feast. All that day he kept his doubt to himself, but the next morning he confronted the king and queen and asked for the truth. Polybus and his wife were indignant at the miscreant who had allowed such words to slip from him, and tried to quiet the youth with evasive replies. He was calmed by the love which shone through all they said, but from that time on suspicion gnawed at his heart, for the words of his enemy had made a deep impression on him. He resolved to leave the palace secretly, and without the knowledge of his foster parents, he set out for the oracle of Delphi, hoping to hear the sun god give the lie to what he had been told. Phoebus Apollo did not deign to reply to his questions. Instead, he revealed a new and far more terrible misfortune than the one Oedipus feared. "You will slay your father," said the oracle. "You will wed your own mother and leave loathsome descendants behind in the world." When Oedipus heard this, he was struck with horror, and since he still regarded Polybus and Merope as his father and mother, he did not dare return home, for fear that fate might guide his hand against the king, and the gods afflict him with madness, so that he would wickedly wed his mother. He left the oracle and took the road to Boeotia. While he was still between Delphi and the city of Dolia, he came to a crossroads and saw a chariot rolling toward him. In it he saw an old man he had never seen before, and with him were a herald, a charioteer, and 2 servants. The charioteer and the old man impatiently crowded the wayfarer from the narrow path. Oedipus, who was quick to anger, lunged out at the charioteer, and at that the old man brandished his goad at the insolent youth and brought it down on his head. This roused Oedipus to senseless rage, and for the first time he used the great strength the gods had given him, lifted the staff he carried on his journey, and struck the old man so that he toppled backwards from the chariot. A fight ensued, and the youth had to defend his life against 3 assailants. But he was younger, and he was stronger than they. 2 he killed. 1 escaped and ran away, and Oedipus continued on his journey. He did not dream that he had done anything but take revenge on some common Phoenician or Boeotian who had tried to harm him. For there had been nothing about the old man to show that he was a dignitary or even of noble birth. In reality, he was Laius, king of Thebes, his father, who had been bound on a journey to the Pyrithian oracle. And so fate fulfilled the prophecy given to both father and son, the prophecy both had so zealously sought to evade. Damasistratus, a man from Plataea, found the bodies lying on the ground, was moved to pity, and buried them. Hundreds of years later, travelers could still see the monument, a heap of stones lying in the fork of the road. Oedipus in Thebes. Not long after this, a fearful monster appeared before the gates of Thebes, a winged Sphinx, whose forepart was that of a maiden, while the hind part had that of the shape of a lion. She was one of the daughters of Typhon and Echidna, the serpent nymph whose fruitful womb had borne so many monsters, and a sister of Cerberus, the hound of Hades, to the Lermaean Hydra and the fire-spewing Chimera. This Sphinx settled on a cliff and asked the people of Thebes all sorts of riddles the Muses had taught her. If a man could not hit upon the answer, she tore him to pieces and devoured him. This affliction came upon the city just as the people were mourning their king, who had been slain on a journey, no one knew whom by. Creon, Queen Jocasta's brother, had become ruler in his stead, and the Sphinx grew so bold that she consumed his own son, to whom she had posed a riddle he could not solve. This last blow decided King Creon to proclaim that whoever freed the city of the monster should receive the realm in reward, and his sister Jocasta to wife. At that very moment the crier was calling out these words. Oedipus entered the city of Thebes. Both the danger and the prize challenged him, and besides, he did not place too high value upon a life so shadowed by gloomy prophecy. He climbed the cliff where the Sphinx had taken up his abode and offered to solve the riddle. The monster was determined to confront this bold stranger with one she considered quite impossible to guess. She said, "In the morning it goes on 4 feet, at noon on 2, and in the evening on 3. Of all creatures living, It is the only one that changes the number of its feet. Yet, just when it walks on the most feet, its speed and strength are at their lowest ebb. Oedipus smiled when he heard this riddle, which did not seem at all difficult to him. "It is a man," he replied. "In the morning of his life, when he is weak and helpless child, he crawls on 2 hands and 2 feet. At the noon of his life, he has grown strong and walks on 2 feet. But when he is old and the evening has come, he needs support and takes a staff for a 3rd foot." This was the correct answer, and the Sphinx was so ashamed of her defeat and so enraged that she threw herself off the cliff and died on that instant. Creon kept his promise. He gave Oedipus the kingdom of Thebes and married him to Jocasta, who was his mother. Through the years she bore him 4 children. First, the twin boys, Itycles and Polynices. Then 2 daughters, the elder of whom was Antigone, and the younger Ismene. But these 4 were not only his children, but also his sisters and his brothers. And here I end my tale for today. But I'll be back with more tales. Many more tales. Until then, my friends, enjoy the journey.